comes to fights, people often imagine having some violent encounter with a bigger person. But honestly, I've never really had any problems with people bigger than me. Sure, there have been a few incidents with big meatheads, but most of those were back in high school. To tell you the truth, I've had way more run-ins with smaller people. If you're like me, medium size. This has very likely happened to you too. You know the kind I mean. Those little guys who have a chip on their shoulder and are out looking to prove themselves because of their minority complex. There's even a name for it. Short man syndrome, Napoleon complex. Have you heard of that? Sure you have, but have you ever heard of big man syndrome or tall guy complex? No. There's no such thing. Guys like that have something called confidence. Motivational speaker Tony Robbins he's as big as the Jolly Green Giant. He's 7'5". But do you ever hear about him picking fights? Of course not. He and guys like him are too busy feeling awesome. And that's my point. More often than not, it's smaller people who are looking to fight. Don't believe me? Well, I have an example to back it up. And it's also a fine story. Once, I was on an intercity bus in Brazil. I was going from Minas Gerais to Sao Paulo, and I was taking an overnight trip through the mountains. I had plans to sleep all the way there, but unfortunately, I had a nasty encounter that very nearly led to a fight. As I took my seat, midway down the bus, I noticed that a midget was sitting in the row in front of me. He was drunk, and he'd built a sort of nest from beer cans, potato chips, and plastic bags, and his party was in full swing as we got on our way. It was 10 o'clock at night, so I expected his festivities to roll to a halt sometime soon. As you might imagine, they didn't. In fact, he got louder and plugged his phone into speakers just to crank up his music. Incredibly, the other Brazilians on the bus just fell asleep as if nothing was happening. Maybe they were used to this sort of thing thanks to the lively nature of their culture. Without earplugs even, those sitting right in front of him and across the aisle from him were sleeping effortlessly, or so it looked. But I wasn't able to sleep a wink. Being a polite Canadian, I asked my little friend, in my awful Portuguese, to turn his music down. At first, he seemed to agree, apologizing and turning his music down a bit. But as the cans of beer disappeared, so did his manners and memory, and the tunes began to raise the roof again. Was I willing to let this go? No. I didn't buy an economy class bus ticket in a South American country to ride in discomfort. So I pressed the issue, giving him a firm nudge. "Hey," I said, "silence." Now, like I said, My Portuguese wasn't that good, so I might have said something else, but there was no mistaking what I meant. It was 3 a.m. now, and everyone was asleep except for me and the tiny drunk DJ spinning his tunes at full volume directly in front of me. I should add at this point that my tiny nemesis seemed to be buddies with the bus security guard, who chatted with him as if they'd known each other for years. So any hope I had for backup was lost. Normally, you'd think a security guard would discourage drunken revelry on the bus in the small hours of the morning. But maybe that's just my party pooper nature influencing my perception of bus etiquette. But here on this bus, midway through Brazil, between Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, in the dead of the night, no one was laying down the law at all. Assuming there is a law. And maybe that's a fine summary of Brazil in general. So there we were at odds. I wanted to sleep, and he had his version of Brazilian Carnival going on with no sign of stopping. Firm nudges and bad Portuguese had shown no result. In fact, he'd gotten worse, glaring and spitting like a deranged dwarf being ferreted out from under a bridge. And I shouldn't forget to mention the farting. On one hand, it's surprising to think such a small person could produce such a foul smell, but then again, babies are small, and they have some of the worst smelling poops on earth. Also, let's not forget skunks. They're only as big as a rabbit, but they can clear entire city blocks with their stink bombs. And my little friend on the bus was another creature along these lines. You'd never think that a dozen cans of beer and a couple bags of sour cream flavored potato chips could make such a smell, but the bus had become a hot box of horrors for the nose. Had most of the occupants not been asleep, they likely would have smashed all the windows in their desperate attempt to get fresh air. But lucky for them, they were asleep. Although I'm sure they were dreaming of being stuck in a garbage pit. Perhaps it was that smell that caused the driver to stop the bus. More likely, it was just a scheduled stop, and the midget wasn't bothering him any more than he was bothering the other passengers or the security guard, all of whom were apparently conditioned to tolerate noise and awful odors. Again, possibly that's a thing native to certain parts of South America. I wish I had that power myself, but I don't. So, both the midget and I were pretty annoyed with each other when the bus stopped and everyone got off to use the bathroom and have a snack. As I recall, the place was enormous, not passing up any advantage to tempt the wallets of intercity travelers. I took a moment to look over a selection of decorative table lamps. The midget, of course, bought more beer and potato chips. We were only halfway to Sao Paulo, and he needed supplies to keep the party going. Let me ask you, what would you have done in this situation? Imagine you and a midget are butting heads, and you're at a bus stop out in the middle of nowhere in a foreign country. I'm sure that many of you would have coaxed him around the back of the gas station and beaten him to death. He was a drunk midget after all. Don't forget, This was in Brazil. So, before you make up your mind, check out the list of the world's most dangerous cities. Count the number of places you see in Brazil. I count 20 in the top 50. Now, go watch City of God or Tropa de Elite, 2 Brazilian movies. These were the 2 movies I watched my first week in Rio de Janeiro to get a sense for the culture. What are the takeaway points to remember? There are 2. First, you are no longer in Texas, Dorothy. Crime in South America is out of hand and makes Canada, or even most of the USA, look like a children's amusement park. Second, if a crime happens in South America, you do not want to call the police, because if you can't sufficiently pay them off, they will arrest you and put you in a Brazilian jail, which is the worst place on earth. Those ideas were floating around in my head as I had a few Brazilian bus stop coxinhas and waited for the bus to refuel. I weighed where I stood if things with the midget went down. Obviously, I was totally confident that I could thrash him in a street altercation. But then what? Would someone call the police? If so, whose testimony would they believe? After all, the midget was friends with the bus security guy while I was just a gringo. The term used down there for people not from South America, especially the white ones. Sure, 2 grown adults willingly fighting isn't illegal, just like 2 adults having consensual sex. If you're down for it, it's not a crime, as far as I know, provided nobody dies. But I thought to myself, who knows what the midget might say after he wakes up in the hospital? And who knows what Brazilian police might do when given the chance to shake down a gringo who has just put a dwarf into a coma? For them, that might be like finding a bag of money just laying on the road, ripe for the plunder. So I thought, if I want to throw down with the midget, I might be opening a can of worms, legally speaking. This was the conclusion I reached when I walked back to the bus. And who did I find standing there in the parking lot? You guessed it, our friend the midget. Reeking of beer farts, with his mouth ringed by potato chip dust. "Let's go," he said, putting his little fists up. "Do you want to fight?" Now, again, what would you have done? Thrown him through a window and risked God knows what in God knows where? Sure, it's fun to think about shouting, "This is Sparta," and kicking him into a well. But I chose the high road, to not beat up a midget. The risk-to-benefit ratio was quite heavily on the side of risk, or so it seemed at the time. Plus, the bus was leaving, and hold on, I'm fighting a midget. It's hardly a reasonable request. So I just pushed past him, said a few choice swear words in Portuguese, and went back to my seat. I might have farted on him as I went by. Back on the bus, things became dramatically less dramatic. As I recall, the midget finally passed out and lay in his seat like roadkill for the rest of the trip. I finally got some shut-eye, but not before considering if his crew would be waiting to meet him at the bus station in Sao Paulo, and whether he would enlist their help to swarm me. Perhaps they would be among the wee folk as well. With that in mind, ask yourself, could you beat a gang of midgets in a street fight? As crazy as it sounds, I had to give that question serious consideration, since I was facing the real possibility of that happening when we got to Sao Paulo. But it didn't happen. When we got there, I just got off the bus and went on my way. The midget I'd come to loathe was nowhere to be seen. Even his nest was gone. What did this mean? I guess he'd gotten off at an earlier stop. Possibly in a town of little people, like in The Wizard of Oz. Or maybe, and this is my other crazy thought, maybe I'd been asleep for the entire ride, and the whole encounter with the midget had been a dream. Sure, that's a fun idea to consider. But I know what really happened, and I'll never ever forget how I nearly fought a midget in the back country of Brazil.